Good morning, everybody. It's Friday. We've got a great chapter going through. In fact, this one I entitled it Beware, because there's actually a lot of things for us to be aware of as we go through it. We see a lot of different things, warnings, etc. And so let's get right into it. The story starts here, kind of setting up the scene for some of the things to come. And so we see here about feeding the 4,000. Now, the thing about the feeding the 4,000 is there's a lot of people that have said that it's no different than the feeding the 5,000. But we obviously see it in both Matthew and in Luke that they talk about both of them, the 4,000 and 5,000. And in fact, we just go down a little bit. Jesus even refers to both of them independently and separately. And so here's the 4,000, and in those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called the disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. Okay, let's go back to the last time, the 5,000. It was the disciples that had the compassion, but their solution was, not to say that Jesus didn't have the compassion, but it was the disciples that brought it up. And they're the ones that said, hey, they haven't eaten. And so their solution was send them out. And Jesus says, what can you feed them? And that threw them off. So I think this is why now they continued for 3 days with him. So day 1, the disciples didn't say anything. Day 2, they still didn't say anything. Day 3, because they kind of got rebuked last time. But as we see here, they didn't even really, not that they didn't remember, but they didn't even think of this being a solution, what he had done last time. But it's kind of funny, after 3 days, now Jesus had compassion on them. It's like, man, we got to feed them before they go away, or else, because they got a long ways to walk, I don't want them to faint. The disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? So they're still looking at the natural and not looking up to heaven and God's provision and his love. And so he asked them, how many loaves do you have? See, last time he asked the disciples, how many loaves and fish can you go find from the people? This time he asks them, what do you have? And so here they just talked about the loaves at first. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. So he started giving them, and he took the 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them, gave them to his disciples, and set them before them, and then set before the multitude. Then they mentioned, oh, by the way, we also have a few fish. It was mentioned that maybe because this was from the provision of the disciples, the loaves, the 7 loaves, and a few small fish, that they just went with the loaves at first. Maybe they didn't want to give all of their provision away until they saw, oh, wait, it's multiplying. Okay, yeah, we can throw in the fish. And having blessed them, he said them, okay, set them also before them. Interesting how that it came in separate waves. First the bread, then the fish. But this was the provision of the disciples. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. This is same thing. Hey, out of God's provision, it's to abundance. It's not just to get you from hungry to not hungry. They were filled. And then yet there was even more more food left over, more baskets left over. And he sent them away, and immediately got into the boat with the disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha, which is not far from Magdala. So this would be kind of like where Mary Magdalene would be from, that region. So that's where we get the name Mary Magdalene, is Mary from Magdala, which is in the same region. Then the Pharisees came out, began to dispute with him. For the Pharisees, did I say disciples? Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. Now, this is really interesting because Jesus has been giving a lot of signs, a lot of miracles. There's been a lot of healings, a lot of things taking place. A guy who's couldn't walk, all of a sudden he can walk, and we see the deaf now able to hear, the blind being able to see, and still this is not good enough for them. They're seeking from him a sign from heaven, and this would be like if we look at Elijah, when Elijah brought the fire down and to burn the altar. This is what they're looking for. They're looking for something from heaven, like almost like with Moses, with the fire by night, when they're being led by the cloud by day and the fire pillar by night, or maybe the manna. They wanted to see something physical. But if these guys couldn't accept the small things, the miracles that Jesus was taking, then what do we think that all of a sudden a sign from heaven, they would probably say that was from the devil also, because they were just testing him. They were just trying to get him. But then he sighed deeply in his spirit. It's like, oh, goodness. And he said, why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no signs shall be given to this generation. And you know what? Actually, if they actually looked throughout the entire Old Testament and through the books that they studied, for instance, Daniel in the 70 weeks, they would see that there's great signs pointing to this time. But he's like, you're not going to get a sign. We see that in Matthew, he says, you're going to get the sign of Jonah, which is, I'm going to be, dead for 3 days and I'll rise again. But they weren't going to be seeing a huge sign from the heavens. They've been seeing tons of signs, and they still weren't changing. So give your head a shake. And so these guys think that they were looking for, something from God. They were just testing him. And maybe, something could have done. Maybe Jesus could have done the same thing as Elijah and burnt them all, but of course he wasn't doing that. Jesus was about grace and mercy, but his spirit, he sighed deeply and just like, oh, when are these guys going to get it? And knowing that they weren't, that they were going to be the ones putting him on the cross. Then he left them, getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread. What? They just had 7 baskets of extra. Well, they probably gave it away to the people so that they had something on their long trip back home. And they did not have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And so this is... we see that if you look at beware of the leaven of the Pharisees in Luke 12, let's go to Luke 12. I think it's in here. Yeah, Luke 12. It says, in the meantime, when there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trode one upon another, he began to say unto his disciples, first of all, beware ye of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So we know that when he's talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, he's talking about hypocrisy. And of course, we see John the Baptist saying, you hypocrites, Jesus calling them hypocrites. What is hypocrisy? Well, hypocrisy is saying one thing and doing another. Or even to us Christians, it would be, just beware of this hypocrisy. Because sometimes we want to live as Christians, we try to act as Christians, we try to make it seem like we're Christians, but yet we look in the natural all the time. Just like the disciples are doing here. We only have 1 piece of bread. And so they're looking at the natural. When Jesus was about to feed the 4,000, they just looked at the natural. So Jesus is saying, beware of this hypocrisy of saying one thing, trying to act one way, but being totally different. And he says, and the leaven of Herod, which I think this has got to do a lot more of the fear of man, because Herod was absolutely crazy about always fearing what others thought. And of course, he didn't want to lose his power. And this was all based on this fear of man and the fear of losing this power he has. When they reasoned among themselves, saying, is it because we have no bread? Is Jesus talking about leaven because we have no bread? They knew it was their job to always be prepared and have things ready. And so they were supposed to have enough bread. So they're thinking, oh my goodness, he's talking about the bread, isn't he? And Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, "Why do you reason because you have no bread?" He's like, "What are you guys thinking? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened?" And then he's talking to them, "Having eyes you do not see, having ears you do not hear. Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of fragments did you take up?" He said, "Oh, 12. Okay, and when we did that with 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets did we take up? 7. So they're looking at the natural. They're thinking we only have one bread, and is it because it's only one bread? And she's like, "No, man, I can multiply this too." Guys, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the leaven of the Pharisees. Now, the interesting about leaven is that leaven, especially with sourdough, as you're making your loaf, you can take a morsel of that, set it aside, make your sourdough, and then take that morsel and put it in the next batch, and it will leaven that next batch. Even a small amount will leaven the entire loaf. And so this is the same thing. It will pass on from generation to generation. If we only think in the natural and we don't think in the spiritual, and we teach others, it continues and it continues. And same with the fear of man. This is also another thing that continues. And so Jesus, I can almost picture it. And he said to them, I wonder what his tone was here. "How is it you do not understand?" Or was he, "Oh, how is it you don't understand?" I don't know what his tone was, but it's very interesting. And so we see this, that the hypocrisy is it can be transferred over, and even the fear of man. But he was really talking about, just beware of this. Look at the spiritual. Don't look at the natural. The Pharisees have been doing this for so long. And so he's just warning the disciples about this. And yet their answer was still in the natural. And so then a blind man healed at Bethsaida. So then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the town, and when he... Okay, so here, Jesus takes the blind man, and he's like, "All right, come on, we got to get out of the town." So he walks him out of the town. Remember yesterday we talked about Jesus also healed the deaf and the mute person, and he also took them apart from the people, and he spit on the guy's tongue. Well, this time he took him out of town and he spit on the guy's eyes. Was it because he didn't want people to see that he's spitting on people? Well, more so is because this guy's from Bethsaida. Well, Bethsaida is one of the 2 towns that got rebuked the most by Jesus. There was Bethsaida, and there was not chorizo, but Corazon or whatever. Let's look at it. It's in Matthew 11. Chorazin. So it says, "Woe unto thee, Chorazin! Woe unto thee, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." So these were 2 towns that had hardened hearts of unbelief. And so Jesus had to take him out of that town, because that town had so much this unbelief. He had to take the blind man, take him out of that area where all the hardened hearts were. And so then spit on his eyes, put his hands on him, and he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and he said, "I see men like trees walking." So obviously the guy couldn't see clearly yet. So the full miracle hadn't totally taken place yet. And so then he put his hands on his eyes again. Now he's not doing this to petition to God again. He just knew that even though he pulled the man out of Bethsaida, now he needed to pull the unbelief of Bethsaida out of the man. And so then he put his hands on his eyes again, made him look up, take his eyes off the natural and onto the spiritual. And then he was restored and saw everyone clearly. This makes me think of a story that I heard, and I forget who it was, whether it be Kenneth Hagin. I think it was Kenneth Hagin. But he was on stage and healing people. And this blind person came up on stage, and so he said he wanted to see. And so then he says, all right, close your eyes. And he prayed, laid hands on him, and then he said, can you see? So the person opened their eyes. And he said, I didn't tell you to open your eyes. He says, close them. So, or he just said, no, close your eyes, close your eyes. So he closes the eyes. The person closes their eyes, and he says, okay, can you see? So the person opens their eyes again. He said, I did not tell you to open your eyes. Close your eyes. So then they close their eyes. He says, can you see? And so then they open it up again, and he said, stop opening your eyes. I'm not asking you if you can see in the natural. And so he says, close your eyes. So then the person closes their eyes, and he says, can you see? And the person with their eyes closed said, I could see. See, now they were picturing that they could see in their hearts. He needed to change the unbelief. This person wanted the evidence that he was healed by opening his eyes. But I think it was Kenneth Hagin. He was saying, no, keep your eyes closed. Can you see? Finally, he could see. And then he said, okay, now open your eyes. And then he opened his eyes and he could see with the physical. And so this makes me think of what Jesus said. Now he made him look up. Now the guy couldn't see, but he made him look up to God, look up to God's provision. And then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither do you go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. Don't go back to that town of disbelief and hardened hearts. Don't go back to that, because they have hardened hearts. It's going to be hard. So don't go back there. And so I named this whole chapter, Beware. This is another beware. Don't go back to where there's unbelief. Don't be hanging out with where there's unbelief, because it can hinder what God is trying to do in your life. All right, so now we see Peter confess Jesus as Christ. This is a little bit less than what is described here in Matthew in the previous book. But now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, who do men say that I am? So they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, others one of the prophets. He says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said to him, you are the Christ. Now, if we look in Matthew 16:17, now once he answered that, and Jesus answered and said unto him, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven has revealed this to you. And this is absolutely true. This is not a carnal thing that they saw, that Jesus is the Christ, but it is through, and obviously it was God the Father that showed them this. Then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him in this way. He didn't want, you can go around and say he's the Christ, but people weren't going to believe this. They weren't going to understand this until it was Father that showed him this. And of course, the Pharisees weren't going to believe this. And in fact, this would incriminate Jesus right away to the Pharisees. He's the Christ? Really? What blasphemy is this? Now, so Jesus was warning them, don't share this to others. Let God reveal this to man, and in due time it will come. So then Jesus predicts his death and resurrection, and he began to teach them the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he spoke this word openly. Then Peter took him aside. I like how he took him aside. Peter obviously had incredible wisdom from God. He knew that Jesus came as the Messiah to relieve them from Rome. And so what is Jesus talking about? That he's going to die? Jesus, come on. You're building up an army. And sometimes I think that these multitudes followed him and stayed around with him for 3 days, probably because they were expecting him to say, okay, guys, we're going to create an army now. I need you guys to join me. That's probably what they're waiting for. Now, of course, they're hearing all this wisdom, and that's keeping them. But they're all waiting for this. Okay, when's the moment? When is he going to take over and put the Pharisees in their place and take over Rome. And when is he going to do this? And so Peter had to instruct Jesus that he obviously doesn't know what he's talking about. So he took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. Now, this is part of the leaven that Jesus was bewaring them of. Beware of the leaven. Don't look in the natural. Don't look at what you think, because this does not line up with the word of God. And so, but when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, so here's Peter, brought him aside. So they're probably next to each other and Peter's rebuking him. Jesus kind of turns around and he brings the disciples into this conversation. He looked at his disciples and he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan. For ye are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." And this is that carnal thinking. Now, of course, he's not saying that Satan is in Peter, but Peter was being used as an instrument for Satan. Also, take note that this is a temptation for Jesus to not go to the cross, to not do what the scripture says. We know that when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he did not want to do this. And so this was now a temptation to not do what God had called him to do on the cross. Yeah, no, there's another solution around this, Jesus. Don't worry. Well, of course, Jesus didn't want to go to the cross. He knew he had to. So this was a temptation being brought. And so he had to rebuke that immediately. And it's the same thing that we have to do when there's temptations. Rebuke that in Jesus' name. Get behind me. I don't think so. Don't get me like that. Then he says to take up the cross and follow him. So when he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, "Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Now, oftentimes now we see the cross as a sign and a symbol of Jesus and redemption, and we've almost like purified what the cross is. The cross really represents death. There was nothing beautiful about it. It's a hanging. If Jesus said, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and walk down death row and follow me, people wouldn't be so happy about what he says. But this is what he's saying. Take up his cross. He's saying we need to die to ourselves. Whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake in the Gospels will save it. And so for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? So this is our self. We need to put ourself aside. We need to raise Christ up as being more important than our own self-indulgences, more than our own maybe our goals or things that we have. Now, goals are great to have. Make sure they line up with what Jesus has. You might have some personal goals, and great, but just make sure that first you seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness, that we put aside self. It's to die to self. This is what he's asking. And that's kind of, if you look at it in one way, here he's telling the disciples that he's going to die, and then now he's asking the disciples that they also die and put themselves aside. So never mind it being a huge news that Jesus is telling him that he's going to die. And they totally forgot about this. Jesus told them he's going to die. They forgot about it until it actually took place in several chapters from now. But this is really about beware. Beware of that leaven of Herod, which is about the fear of man, but really that's self-preservation. Really, we try to put ourselves because we're just trying to be our own providers, be our own healers, be our own everything. But God is that. So let's put ourselves aside, all that aside. And that's really what it comes down to. So, all right, a lot of bewares here. Hopefully we can learn from it. I know that we often struggle, just like the disciples. We see so many things take place, and yet, Phil, come on, why do you not understand? Why do you still have unbelief in this area? I think that's to all of us. But let's keep growing. Stay in the Word. That Word is what changes our heart as we renew our mind and keep growing in that. So, all right, be a blessing out there. Have a great weekend. It is Friday, so enjoy your weekend. We'll see you on Monday with Mark 9. And remember, always stay filled up. God bless.